Welcome to another insightful episode of Into the Digital Future. I'm Jordan Shapiro.
I'm Laura Higgins. Jordan, we've explored so many facets of the digital world and the impact it has on mental health, but today we're going to go even deeper.
That's right. We've got a great guest today who's going to add some really valuable perspectives, I think, to our ongoing conversation about diversity, mental health, and technology.
I'm really excited about this one too, Jordan. Our guest, Dr. Earl Turner, brings a wealth of knowledge on how intersectionality plays into mental health experience in the digital age.
Yeah, he's a renowned psychologist with enormous expertise in mental health, particularly focusing on diverse youth in our increasingly connected world.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that really struck me from our conversation with Dr. Turner was his nuanced take on social media. And it aligns so much with what we've been discussing previously about the potential for both positive and negative impacts.
Definitely, he totally reinforces that understanding about this idea that digital platforms really can be powerful tools for marginalized communities to find support and access. But he does that in a way that's not one sided. So he really also addresses the challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was so helpful for me with my Roblox hat on. So Dr. Turner offered some really fascinating insights on how tech companies particularly can better leverage expert knowledge to create and disseminate truly helpful mental health content.
Yeah, absolutely. And then let's also not forget that his important message about not misusing mental health terminology in our public discourse, our public conversation. I know we've talked about that before, but he does it in a really fresh. He does it really in a fresh way.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing really particularly, I was interested in his thoughts about protecting your peace when you're in digital spaces. And it's a concept I think our listeners can really find valuable.
Yes. Parents, educators, caregivers that are all going to appreciate Dr. Turner's practical advice on managing healthy social media use for teens, and I think it's a really nice complement to all the conversations we've had in all our previous episodes. So if you like this episode, subscribe and listen to all the other ones.
Oh, you're absolutely right, Jordan. His insights on the ongoing debate around cell phones in schools added yet another layer to our ongoing exploration of that particular topic.
Yeah, longtime listeners and new listeners are all going to like Dr. Turner's expertise. It's really he helps deepen our understanding of the intersection between mental health, diversity, technology, and all the things we're always talking about here.
Are you ready to expand your perspectives and gain some new
I
insights?
am ready. Let's dive in with Dr. Turner.
I'm Dr. Erlanger Turner, also known as Dr. Earl. I'm a licensed psychologist, author, professor, and media contributor. And I'm also the founder and executive director of Therapy for Black Kids, which is an organization focused on promoting resilience and healthy development among Black youth.
Really glad to have you here, Dr. Earl. We have talked to so many, we do so much talking here about kids' well-being, specifically, usually in relationship to the digital world. But we've had so many different experts who are experts on child development, experts on teenagers and emotion, experts on adolescent. And one thing that really is missing is that we kind of talk about all teenagers as if they're like one giant group of people that are all the same. And they're, of course we talk about small gender differences here and there, but we really don't talk about specific populations. So I'm really interested if you could tell us a bit about your work. What fascinates me about it is, like, obviously there are real distinct concerns for Black teenagers and adolescents in terms of mental health, and a very distinct experience. And I obviously don't know that much about it. So hopefully you could tell us a bit about what that work that you do, and why you do it, and what people should know about it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, the point about mental health among all youth is definitely important. And there are a lot of similarities in terms of the challenges that youth experience as just sort of part of normal development. But I do think that for youth of color, and particularly my work centers mostly around African American and Black youth, is that there are some unique experiences that they may have that are very, very different, from their counterparts, in particular white teens. And so a lot of my work has really started primarily focusing in on understanding attitudes and perceptions around mental health service use within the Black community. And we know that for Black youth, they oftentimes are less likely to receive care compared to other communities. And so really trying to understand what can I do in my role from sort of a public education perspective and from my own research is how can we sort of improve those attitudes and reduce some of that stigma to make sure that these youth are getting access to services, because we know that some of those challenges that they may experience definitely impact them differently in terms of their mental health. And one sort of common or issue that we see happening consistently over time is the ways that they experience, hate or racial discrimination, and that does have a huge impact on their mental health. And that discrimination happens in multiple spaces that they have to encounter, whether it's within the school environment, in their communities, and even in the digital space in terms of social media. So those are some really important issues that we have to talk about.
I wonder if you could say a bit, if you had to just say to people who really haven't thought about this at all, like what would some of the less obvious challenges be, right? Like discrimination, of course. I think everybody can wrap their head around that idea, really. But what about the sort of subtle discrimination, the subtle effects of code switching, things like that people are dealing with that I imagine many of our listeners, they don't even consider.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So I think another piece to that angle for me is also understanding intersectionality and different aspects of someone's identity. So yes, being Black in America comes with its own sort of challenges, but also we know that, Black girls tend to be overly sexualized. Even when they're not trying to be, they're perceived in that type of way by, adults. And we see boys that are oftentimes being perceived as being overly aggressive. And so that impacts them in terms of risk for increased likelihood of suspension within the school environment. We also see some of the challenges around LGBTQI youth as well. And so those are issues that, oftentimes are not even talked about when it comes to the experiences of LGBT youth and the amount of hate, homophobia that they experience, not only outside of their community, but sometimes even their homes are not safe. And so I think those are also some really important conversations to talk about. Yes, LGBT youth have very different experiences. Some have really positive experiences within their homes, but we also know that there is also sometimes, hateful comments. Sometimes it's just misunderstanding within communities. And I think, another challenge that comes up for me is that I think sometimes for Black parents, when they have a child that does come out as being, LGBTQ, is that they are concerned about the child's safety. And so those are some of the things that make them a little bit more protective around, their child actually, disclosing their sexuality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that really resonates with me. As you can probably hear, I'm based in the UK, not in the US. And just reflecting on what that experience, for friends of mine and people that I've worked with, over my career, we have very similar issues, but they're also really distinctly different. And so whilst there's kind of, belonging and the discriminatory stuff. So for sure, right here, we actually have some focus on young Black people's experience of the health service here in the UK. Our health is very different than it is in North America in the terms of, we have our National Health Service, but actually the success rates opportunity for maternity is really, really poor, particularly within the Black community, and actually access to good education here. We do have this situation where the kids just, generally just don't get the opportunity to attend the so-called good schools. And so right from the offset, that sort of happens here. But I do understand it's a very different cultural experience than is happening in the US. So it's really interesting to hear. So, yeah, you have a new book out. So Raising Resilient Black Kids, a parent's guide to helping children cope with racial stress, manage emotions and thrive. So I love that title. It's one of the things we really focus on in my work at Roblox is about helping people thrive in online spaces and beyond. So tell us a little bit about the book, but really, what does thriving look like for you?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's actually a really interesting process of, coming up with the title for a book. So I learned a lot, about that process. But for me, thriving is really having this sense of well-being in the midst of dealing with challenges or negativity. And I think for many people, and particularly youth, that it's really hard to thrive when you're constantly dealing with all of these things that are going on in society and in our communities. And so it's how can we have the tools to be able to manage some of our stressors that we're experiencing in society and be able to sort of live sort of this sense of well-being. Not to say that, you won't have those difficult days, but that in the midst of those, that those days are not going to really disrupt your life in ways that are really, challenging for you to ever even navigate.
Yeah, I've got the quote, "The rose that grows through concrete," in my head right now.
On this podcast, we focus almost, we focus on digital media, we focus on social media, we focus on video games and the metaverse, and I guess I'd be curious to know what's your take on it? Like as you work with teens, as you interact with adolescents, as you interact with the youth, what do you see? We all see, we all hear all the media against it, and then I don't want to, and some of that comes from a good place, from an accurate place, and some of that comes from a moral panic place. But I'd be curious to know, like, as you actually, what you can tell us about what you actually see outside of the headlines and the buzzwords and the.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I think one of the things that we have to realize about social media and technology is that oftentimes it is a replication of what we see in real life. And so one of my colleagues has used the term digital neighborhood. So that's not something that belongs to me, but I like that term because I think it really does mimic what we see in real life, and that we have to recognize that, kids are not in this vacuum when they're on social media platforms, that these are also things that are happening in society and in communities in our schools. And so I think we have to understand, like, how are they navigating this digital space? It's also important to how they're navigating things within real life. And so we want to make sure that they have the awareness to really understand, information that they're, consuming on those platforms, and that parents are also involved in some of those conversations. So I think one of the really important things that I talk about is, when you send your kid out in the community, you don't just say, okay, I'll see you when you get back home, right? You give them some type of advice or suggestions about what places not to do, encounter, who to not talk to or engage with. And so I think when we come to the digital neighborhood, that we sometimes get lost in that, oh, my teen is on this phone, on this platform, I don't know what they're doing, I don't know how to talk with them about this. And so it's like, how can you also engage in some digital literacy yourself so that you understand what's going on and that you prepare your child to also navigate that space?
Thank you. That's my whole job. So that makes me really happy. And it's a huge challenge, and particularly getting in front of people all over the world of all different demographics. We always talk about the fact that there's digital literacy, but, there's people all over the world who their parents are not even literate, so getting those messages across, they're not there going to read a website to go and download a resource and learn about these things. So we have to be really creative about how we get those important messages across. I mean, I think you've sort of answered this, but we've seen, over the last years, a huge amount of focus, really quite negative focus on teens and adolescents, and the correlation or not of poor mental health based on social media scrolling, doom scrolling, all that stuff. And we've seen fairly recently calls for like out and out bans on social media or banning cell phones and things. What's your take on that? It feels like maybe you're not in favor, but yeah, interesting topic. I'd love to get your view.
Yeah, it is a really interesting topic. And I think, if it comes to a ban, that it's going to be challenging to enforce that. So I think I'm a realist, I like to say. And so I think when we come up with all of these policies or rules, it's like, who's going to enforce this outside of just, having this law about, not having the access to the platform. And so for me, it really is recognizing both the pros and cons of social media and technology in the lives of teens. And as I mentioned before, that, oftentimes it is a replication of what is happening in real life. And so it's, if you're thinking that, social media is I don't know, quote unquote, like ruining, the child's life. What are these things that happen in our society? Like, are we addressing those things that are also, impacting, teens' lives as well? So I think for me, it really is recognizing, the good and the bad of social media. And I wrote a blog a couple of years ago on Psychology Today. And one of the things that I noted was some research from the Pew Research Center around, some of the ways that teens in particular see benefits in social media. And so the majority of teens find that social media is actually helpful for them. And so looking at my notes here that I wrote down, is like 68% of teens say that social media actually helps them to feel supported through tough times. And so imagine that, we take this away from those teens, how are they going to feel supported, now? And that goes back to my earlier point that I mentioned around, let's say LGBT youth, for example, is that and a lot of times they don't have that support or that, sense of community or connection. And so social media provides that way for them to actually stay, connected as well. And then another piece that is important is, teens also find it difficult to give up social media. So I know that, part of the conversation comes in around like, teens being like addicted, for example. But I think outside of that, over half of teens also report that they would find it very, very hard to give that up. And I know in a lot of, states in the US right now, schools are actually banning access to phones or social media throughout the school day. And I definitely understand the need to do that. I mean, I grew up in a time frame where we didn't have cell phones, in school. And so I think that that's important because you want to focus on the learning, but also I think you're potentially creating some additional problems because now teens are going to be thinking about these phones and still being distracted. So it's like, what do we do to really make sure that we're addressing, the meat of the problem?
Great. And I would just say, just for reference, Jordan and I grew up in a time where there weren't cell phones, period.
I didn't like that. I didn't like that comment, Laura. No, but
True.
but I love I love what you've said, and Dr. Earl, and of course I've my view on this is well known, well promoted, and like while there is certainly I'm not going to deny that there have been lots of kids who have ended up with really poor mental health outcomes because of their relationship with social media and their experience on social media. We also know that there are enormous amounts of positive experiences. People have been able to find affinity groups. People, whether those are identity-based affinity groups or hobby affinity groups or eating disorder groups. Right? We know how many people are being helped by that, and so that it makes me want to ask you a question of where do you see the ways in which we could be using the potential of not just social media but all online interactions for what are we not doing yet, right? It seems to me like there really is the potential for so much incredible social justice work, activism that could happen through this social media, and some of it is, of course, but where do you think we're missing? Where do you think we're still missing the target?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And before I answer that, I want to go back to your point about the ways that a lot of conversations have talked about how social media is negative and creating mental health problems and increasing risk of eating disorders, for example. And I understand those connections, but also as a scientist and researcher, I know that most of that research and data is not it's correlational. So we're understanding these relationships. And so we don't know if the eating disorder or the mental problem came first. And now that is driving them to spending more time on social media, which some of the research, speaks to in that manner. And so I think we have to really do a better job as researchers with really understanding like what comes first in terms of, is it that, kids are spending this much time on social media, they're getting disconnected, they're getting consumed with misinformation or inappropriate information. And so that's leading to some of these problems. And that can help us better answer sort of that connection between social media and these mental health challenges. But I think one of the things that is really important that we may be missing in terms of how we can use social media for good is when it comes to the algorithm. And I know this comes up a lot in conversations, and I don't understand the algorithm, even though I've done some, consultation work with some tech companies. But I do think that what information is pushed out, that there can be, much more intention placed on that. In particular, when we have experts in the fields of, pediatrics, mental health, that are, pushing out content or creating content around some ways to help people understand themselves from a health and a mental health perspective. And that information may not get disseminated or shared as often as things that may be talking about things that may be traumatizing or potentially triggering. And so I think those are some of the ways that, some of these companies could do a better job about how do they leverage those expertise of those professionals, and making sure that that content is shared, even with just their audience. Because I know sometimes I will post content and I see like I get 100 views or something like that. And it's like, okay, this is not going anywhere. So, how can that content, be sent out to the public more, so that that way they can have the tools to really understand, some of these things, and even sort of misuse of terminology that I think, in the general public, one of the things that is very, I don't want to say triggering, but problematic for me is this misuse and overuse of trauma. Like everything is trauma. And that's really not the case in terms of how we think about it in terms of mental health.
I love that. And hopefully I can make you happy. Just to reassure you, there is some really good stuff happening behind closed doors. So we're actually part of a group, which is a multi-agency, multi-stakeholder, all lots of tech companies involved, as well as NGOs and not-for-profits. It's led by the United Nations, and it's called Protection Through Online Participation. And it is really focused on young people's voice and finding out where they seek support in online spaces about real world issues. So real world violence, domestic abuse, self-injury and suicidal concerns. Those are not normal topics that somebody might look on Roblox or TikTok for, but actually we know that they are. And so there is a piece of work specifically looking at how we can use those algorithms to best effect to raise up those support services to make sure that young people get that in the moment support that they need. So there really is work happening, but I agree with you, it's a little too late, and we have a lot more to do. So on that point, how do we make sure, from I work in the tech industry, how do we make sure us and other stakeholders, the policymakers and law enforcement and everyone else, educators, we're looking at you too, but how do we make sure that we build these really inclusive, safe, welcoming spaces, and just being mindful about all demographics, all different cultures, and the people that come on our platform? Like for us, we appreciate that on Roblox we have a really high group of young people with neurodivergence who are creating experiences. So we've started working with autism groups in the US and the UK to get a better understanding of how we support those families. That's one example. What else can we do? What do we need to do to be better?
Yeah, no, first, thanks for sharing that. I think that's really great work. And I think that there are a lot of tech companies that are trying to do some things to help, address this sort of issue and challenge that we're dealing with in society. And in my own work, I've worked, with some companies as well, and I won't do any sort of promotion of those companies, but I will say that, there are some tech companies that are providing sort of resources and guides for parents to like understand, some of these pieces, how to have healthy conversations, with their teens about this. And I think one of the things that I talk about a lot is, how do you maintain that line of communication with your teen around why they're using social media? I think a lot of times it is that you're telling your kid, well, you don't need to be on this phone, you don't need to be on this, application, et cetera. But we don't try to explore why they wanted to be on those things. And so I think that's a really important piece of that conversation. But going back to your question, I think that one of the things that can be helpful is trying to engage stakeholders as much as possible. And I realize that that is a resource, that, it requires a lot of resources to be able to do that. But I think that that's really important to the success of these platforms, is trying to make sure that the stakeholders are involved in those conversations. And so whether it is the professionals that are doing this work, I have this sort of expertise or knowledge, but also getting information from teens and parents around what are some of the challenges that they're seeing, and what are some of the ways that they've been able to navigate those in a healthy way, and can you sort of create some ways to do that also in some of these applications? Because I do think that for some parents, they've been able to figure out ways about how do you manage, or help your teen rather manage their time on social media. And also, are you doing those things? So I think a big piece for me is making sure that as parents that you model healthy engagement with social media and technology. And sometimes as adults, I think we don't do that either, but then we expect our teens to be able to set some boundaries around it. So I think a big piece of it is modeling, that as well. So I think those can be other ways around how do these tech companies and platforms work with parents to give them some tools, because I think for a lot of parents, it's like they don't understand or know, and sometimes they don't care to know. But I do think that when you are parenting a teen, that it requires some sort of different roles, of you. And I realize, that as parents, I say this all the time, like parents don't come with a manual, right? You have to figure things out as you go. And so there is some learning that's required for you along the way as well to engage in healthy parenting. And so those are some ways that I think, tech companies can really support parents along this journey.
Amazing. Thank you.
Well, I couldn't agree more that parenting is really difficult, especially because you don't have a manual. I recently had to have a long talk with my teenager, one of my teenage sons, and I said, it's really kind of a terrible thing. You get no practice, and the stakes are so high, and you make mistakes, and you're, even if you have more than one kid, they're different people, so it's not like the practice helped, right? It's hard, and it's a lot, even someone like me that's a parenting expert, like it's constantly difficult, right? It's constantly difficult. It's constantly painful. I have lots of nights with lots of tears and lots of anxiety for myself. Which leads me to our final question, which is we've seen that you say protect your peace. This is something you say. So what do you do to protect your peace?
Yeah, so I think protecting your peace is really important in the digital space. So for me personally, that means that I sometimes have to be really intentional about disengaging. And so I know that for some people, and particularly for teens, that it could be really difficult to log off or to uninstall, an app on your phone because you feel like you're missing out on something. And so what I remind myself is that if I don't see it because I'm not there for days or weeks, it's still there's the internet. So it will come back to you. And oftentimes it will see posts that pop up and it's like, oh, this was in 2022. And so I think that just remind yourself that if you do decide to take a social media break for however amount of time, that the content is still going to be there. So you're not really missing out on anything. You may not get it sort of at that sort of timely moment as sort of breaking news per se, but it's still going to be there. And so I think that's one way to sort of help me for sort of protect my peace, is being able to sort of disengage. I also think is like, how do you engage with content? So even if you decide not to, let's say physically not log on to the platform, that there can be ways that you don't engage with content. So if you see videos that says it's sensitive content, read the caption, decide to keep scrolling as opposed to like clicking on it and then, oh, you read it or you see it and like, I probably shouldn't have watched this, right? And so I think that's another way that you sort of protect your peace as well. And then a really important thing I think that is helpful that just sort of popped into my head now is, how do you sort of do some evaluation of the content that you are following? So I think there may be time periods where I follow a lot of news pages. So it may be that, with the election season coming, for example, that I might unfollow those news platforms because I don't want to get any news at that moment until I decide to look it up. And I can always put in their name and I can find their content. So I think that's another strategy that could be helpful to protect your peace, is that are there platforms or are there creators or organizations that produce certain type of content that in general is helpful for you, but at this particular moment in your life, you decide that I'm not going to sort of engage with that content, and I can always come back to it later. So that would be another suggestion that I would think about in terms of protecting your peace.
Such helpful advice. I'm just thinking about what I see on my own platforms because I do try to manage it, but because my area of focus, and Jordan, this will probably, resonate with you as well. It's like I was on LinkedIn yesterday and every other post was about mental health or well-being, and it actually made me feel more anxious because it's like, wow, everybody's having such a bad time. We need to give top tips for managing your well-being. And I was like, okay, I really need to get a grip on what's happening. And there's the algorithms, but it's what I've asked for. So there's a really good example of I need to protect my peace a bit more.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Earl. It's been a pleasure talking to you. It's been a pleasure getting to know you. Anything else you want to say that we haven't asked you about?
I would just sort of go back to the idea about, making sure that you're engaging in healthy social media use. And obviously, like, whatever that means in terms of like healthy is something that you sort of define for yourself. But I think making sure the amount of time that you spend on platforms, who are you following, who are you engaging with, and really having a conversation with your teens around some of that as well, in terms of like, are there things that they find to be distressing for them? And so maybe that's a point of conversation for you as a parent to say, well, maybe you want to take a break from following, this page for a little bit of a while. So I would say really thinking about, it's all about moderation. We talk a lot about moderation in a lot of aspects of our lives. And so I think for healthy social media use, that you also want to think about it in that way.
Brilliant. Excellent advice. Thank you.
Into the Digital Future has been brought to you by Roblox and the Joan Gantz Cooney Center at Sesame Workshop.
Presented by Jordan Shapiro and Laura Higgins.
Supported by our editor, John Dodato.
And our technical producer, Matt Clark.
For more information, visit cooneycenter.org/future. Thanks for listening.